Important that these quarterly declarations are as accurate as is reasonably possible. Now, one area of originally, I would say, not mass panic, but significant concern within the industry was that the Treasury wanted all statements, invoices, which were sent after packaging components had become liable for the tax, to the first business customer to declare on them how much plastic packaging tax had been paid. And the reason this was quite worrying is that it opened a lot of administrative burden, because businesses were looking at this and saying, well, that means that if I pay the tax, I then have to tell every single one of my customers how much tax has been paid on every single order they make. They might make 50, 60 orders within a period, rather than just my one batch of manufacturing for each individual component during that same period. So it was a lot of administrative burden and a lot of confusion. Well, they have clarified, HMRC here, that when the tax goes live the 1st of April, that will not be a requirement. However, it will likely come in at a later date. We still don't know when that eventual date of implementation will be. Potentially kind of could be looking at towards the end of next year. We could be looking at 2023, or we could be looking further afield, but we get the feeling that this is likely to be done on a voluntary basis for supplier and commercial agreements between manufacturers and retailers. But really, we're still waiting for an update from HMRC on exactly when this will be a requirement. So another thing that we've had recently from HMRC is they did provide a bit of an update on liability. So how you can kind of, in inverted commas, easily determine whether or not you're liable under the tax. So rather than the, I'd say, relatively complex document which they provided, we've boiled this down into kind of two-tiered systems. So first of all, it's important that you look at component liability. So whether or not the plastic components you're handling are liable. So this is a three-step process. So do you manufacture plastic packaging components in the UK? Do you import plastic packaging components into the UK, either empty or filled? And do you perform the last substantial manufacturing process prior to the pack filling? So that's the extrusion, molding, layering, forming, printing, etc. If it's yes to any of those, you would be liable for that component. And then you need to look at the business liability. So as a business, this is a two-step process. If you're going to import or manufacture greater than 10 tons of that type of component in the next 30 days, you're liable and need to register. And if you have manufactured or imported greater than 10 tons of that plastic component in the last 12 months, you're liable and will need to register. And that's what's referred to as a forwards and backwards look. So the forwards being next 30 days and the backwards being the last 12 months. Now, as I mentioned earlier, joint and several liability does apply for this tax. So the first party to commercially exploit the packaging in the UK will ultimately be liable, but everyone in the supply chain is expected to carry out their own due diligence. And that would include spot checks on material, getting information from suppliers on whether or not that 30% recycled content does or doesn't apply, as well as with other exemptions. So there's a well-known now exemption around transit packaging. So at the point of import, any transit shrink wrap, it's transit packaging which is removed from imported material is exempt from the tax, but it is the responsibility of everyone in the supply chain to ensure that where that is discounted, it is discounted for the right reasons and not solely just because it is imported. And I think there is a lot of confusion that could come out of this, but it is really important as an industry and as a supply chain that we look to carry out the right levels of due diligence and make sure that all packaging that we're handling has been considered for its role within the tax, where it is, of course, plastic. Now, there are quite steep penalties for fraudulent evasion of taxes in the UK. So I think the minimum fine starts at, into the multiple thousands. I think 20,000 is the kind of maximum fine put for an individual. I think it can be higher for businesses, and ultimately there is an imprisonment issue here as well. So if you don't get this right, in theory you could go to jail. So it is really important that we get this right and we get the right levels of data collected. So closing now back to kind of, we've talked about a lot of things that we are aware of. There's still a lot of things that unfortunately we just don't have clarity from HMRC on yet. So to start off with, there's an issue here around degrees of precision. So the figures throughout the tax that are quoted are 30% recycled content by weight. What we still don't yet have clarity on is to what degree of accuracy. So when we submit reports and submit quarterly recordings to HMRC, they will be done in tons, but to the nearest 3 decimal places, so effectively to a kilogram. But what has not yet been clarified is whether the 30% recycled content will be rounded to the nearest kilogram, nearest ton, nearest gram. And obviously, if you're looking at an individual component and trying to identify recycled content, you would probably want to be looking at the gram and even below. Whilst if you're looking at a full manufacturing batch, a gram doesn't really make a huge amount of difference. It would be more a kilogram, maybe a ton, where you start to have bigger levels of variability. So it's really important that we get more clarity from HMRC on that. As we mentioned, the invoices liability has been delayed, but we're still not exactly sure when that will come in and what exact wording will be required. So we're hoping for more guidance from HMRC there. There's a number of specific use cases. So this is where the main function of a packaging component isn't a core packaging function. And a lot of businesses, I think, are concerned that their material will come under the tax, even though they don't see it as packaging or don't see it as a plastic component. All we can really advise here is to query HMRC individually, and they will give you an answer. And if it's the answer, if the answer is a yes, it is not liable under the tax, you will then have a record that you can use in future as part of your reports when you're indicating that you're not liable for that piece of packaging. But ultimately, there is always a chance they turn around and say, yes, that actually should be liable under the tax, in which case you'll need to report it. As I mentioned about exports, there's this kind of expectation of communication. So you've got the liable party that pays the tax and then the exporter that exports it, but only the liable party can claim a credit. So is there a need for some requirement of communication? I mean, there is a commercial value in that, but we have to wait and see really until the tax begins to see what level of buy-in is gained there. Due diligence is used a lot within the tax document when referring to the supply chain, but there's not really much in terms of a definition of what we mean by due diligence. So it would be handy for HMRC to clarify that. And then finally, the actual definition of what an individual component is. So I talked about components in a hand separable mechanism, so a cap, label, bottle, etc. That's not technically clear at the moment throughout the tax. There was previously wording of hand separable components, but that has since been removed. So it's really important that we get clarity on this. We do expect individual packaging components, so a cap, a label, a bottle, etc., to be the consideration point, but it's not yet clear in the guidance that HMRC have provided. So yeah, just to close off then, we've got less than 4 months until the tax goes live. The first quarter of data collection will begin from the 1st of April. So the first actual submissions to HMRC won't be until mid-July. But really, we are so close to the launch of the tax now that it is important we consistently roll back to HMRC with all the areas we don't yet know the answer to, and You know, as part of the questions today, we'll obviously approach a lot of that, but also if anyone has anything they're unsure about, you're more than welcome to reach out to us or Robert for more clarification. So I'm just going to hand over to Robert.